Welcome to this lecture on James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. This particular lecture, we're going to only look at verses 1 through 5a instead of the entire section because it's just too long to do in one lecture, but maybe we'll have two shorter shorter lectures. So this section is a really interesting section because it deals with it begs the question of whether this James 1 3, 1 through 12 is focusing on censoring a teacher or if this is a prohibition against speech acts. In other words, is James here targeting a teacher or is James here targeting kind of the general use of our tongue? So we're going to look at that throughout this pericope from 3:1 through 3:12. And just ask yourself, well, as you read through this passage, as you read Johnson's commentary, he does a lot about moral discourse and how the tongue is used as a trope in a lot of the Greco-Roman philosophy and rhetoric around speech acts. He also talks about the Septuagint and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible and the tradition within Judaism or Judeanness around that kind of stuff. But you know by now that I see James confronting both Roman imperialism and Pauline hybridity. So if that first section in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 deals with an attack on the Roman patronage system, which was basically how the economy was structured, a socioeconomic structure. And chapter 2, 14 through 26, confronts certain Pauline hybridity concerning faith and works. Where does he go in this next section, chapter 3, verses 1 through 12? Is it a general instruction on how to tame the tongue, or is this specific instruction on how James is censoring a rival teacher? In other words, he's telling another teacher to keep his mouth shut. We'll see. I mean, this is, Johnson, I think, argues that this is mostly dealing with how to speak and speech ethics, and I certainly take it as a teacher-oriented confrontation. So check us both, read both of our works, and pay real close attention to it. But specifically, read the text for yourself and try to determine whether or not you think this is a prohibition against bad language or the improper use of your tongue, or whether this is confronting another teacher. So let's look kind of in general at this section. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 is prefigured already in James 1:19, where he says, be slow to speak. So he's already talking about speech acts. 126, if you think you're religious, if anyone thinks they are religious and do not bridle their tongue. Now that's a really important word, the bridle part. I transliterated it there in Greek for you. It's a kalinagogon, kalinagogon glosson. So glosson is tongue. Glossolalia is kind of the way we talk about speaking in tongues, the gift of tongues. Here, the tongue here is just, literally the physical muscle in your mouth, right? So if you think that you're religious and do not bridle your tongue, but deceive your heart, your religion is worthless. So this is leading up to the theme. 126 and 27 are the theme passages for the entire letter. So James already has speaking in mind here. And the word bridle is important because that's the same language James uses in chapter 3, 1 through 12. And then again, just in our the opening section of the letter chapter 2, 1 through 13, James says, speak like this, so speak, and so act. Talk like this, act like this. And basically, that's in his partiality section. So we know that speech is going to be a big deal in the letter of James already. He's talked about it twice in his opening chapter in the epitome. He's brought it up in his first section of the body of his letter, and now he deals with this head on. So is he censoring a teacher? I mean, the opening verse here, 3:1 says, not many should become teachers, didaskaloi. Not many should become teachers, my brothers. Again, my brothers is used every time he really is kind of being emphatic about stuff. Because you know that we will receive a greater judgment. The we part is important in this section. This is we is first person plural. So James is putting himself in the category of teacher here, which is pretty important. James understands himself. This is something, because he uses this language, we know that this is a part of who this James is. I mean, when scholars try to figure out, is this James of Jerusalem? This is one of the sections because he uses this first person plural verbal form. So it's clear that James considers himself a teacher by the way he uses this first person plural verbal form here. We will receive, which is important because we know now that James is a teacher and he is being very focused here on teachers. And it's a command, should. It's commands against some being teachers. So he's really saying you shouldn't want to do this. You shouldn't try to be a teacher. And it's pretty obvious here. He's talking to teachers. And he returns to the theme of judgment, which is already a recurring theme in chapter 2, 12 through 13, where he talks about speaking. That's the same verse where he talks about judgment. So the fact that speaking and judgment are already in chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, lets us know that here that this kind of judgment is much stricter for teachers. And it seems like James is okay. He seems like he's living up to that standard, or certainly thinks he is. But this is a clear warning about people becoming teachers, because when teachers speak, the consequences are even greater. So already the very beginning verse is not about speech acts. It's about teachers and their teachings. So the question is judgment the main reason people should not become teachers, or is this a warning against false teaching? And I think that's exactly what it is. James isn't just saying, hey, the judgment's going to be harder on teachers. It's harder on teachers because of their role, because of this office of teacher. You'll be judged with greater, in a greater way. And that's because the role of the teacher is important, and what teachers say leads congregations down the good path or a bad path. And I think that's exactly what James is doing here. He's certainly criticizing the use of the tongue, but it's not just the tongue he's criticizing here. He starts with didaskaloi, which is teachers. And so the speech that comes after this, or the concentration on the tongue that comes after this first verse, is not just a general tongue. It is the tongue of the teacher. And so this prohibition against bad speaking or the improper use of the tongue has teachers in focus here. So moving to verse 2, you get this stumbling speech. And that stumbling is important for all of us, again, the first person For all of us stumble in many ways. If someone does not stumble, the same use of the word there, in word, that man is perfect, able to bridle, and that bridle is what was used already in chapter 1, right? Kalena gogosai, uh, able to bridle indeed the whole body. The whole body is real interesting here too, and we'll have to focus on each section of this verse. Again, the use of the first person plural verbal form, patayamen, there the omen ending is the first person plural. And this lets you know that James, again, is putting himself in the role of the teacher. He obviously considers himself a teacher. Yeah, but then in the same verse, he returns to the theme of perfection, which we've already seen in chapter 1:4, chapter 1, verse 17, chapter 1, verse 25, chapter 2, verse 8, and the theme of wholeness, which is deeply connected to perfection, this teleos, and the wholeness is halon. So in chapter 1, verse 4, wholeness and perfection are used in the same verse. And then in chapter 2, verse 8 and verse 10, wholeness and perfection are used very close to each other. So here we get a revisiting of these themes, but here it's the perfect man, the teleos aner. The perfect man is the one who doesn't stumble in word. Here, in word is logoi, which is where we get the word logos from. So they're not stumbling in word. This is important because word here is used instead of the tongue. Now, it's certainly synonymous, but James is very careful in the words that he uses. And here he doesn't use tongue, he uses in word, which sounds like teachers, and he's talking about teachers stumbling in many ways. If some teachers don't stumble in their teaching, their word, that man is perfect. Stumbling is a moral failing in a lot of sense. This is the same word, and this might be some parts of the Jesus tradition here, where later on in the Gospels, Jesus says, if you were to cause one of the little ones to stumble, it's better for a millstone to be tied around your neck and to thrown into the ocean. There, Jesus is specifically talking about teachers who cause people to stumble in their faith. Well, this probably prefigures those words of Jesus, and James is using them here in his own way. And this is definitely focused on teachers here, right? That teacher who doesn't stumble is perfect, and indeed, takes care of the whole body. Able dunatos. Again, this is an important word in James. It reminds readers of able to save, into the implanted word. And again, you got the same word, logos, the implanted word, is able to sozai, save. That's into chapter 1:21. And then just the reverse of that in chapter 2:14, where he gets into that faith and works binary. Faith is not able to save. Here, that word is able is used here again, and it's used in a way very similar to the way it's been used before. Able to bridle. Again, that same word in chapter 1. That man is perfect, able to bridle indeed the whole body. So by controlling the tongue or controlling speech, or maybe saying the right things, it makes the teacher perfect, and it makes the teacher capable of controlling the whole body. Bridle, again, let's verse 26, chapter 1:26. It says, and do not bridle their tongues. We've already talked about that. It's the same word, kalenagogon. Here, it's instead of a participle, it's a verb, kalenagogosai. It's the same word, so it's absolutely kind of pointing you back to those who are not able to bridle the tongue. Here, this person's able to bridle their word, and by doing so, it makes them perfect. But also the whole body. The whole body is very important here because Paul uses body language a lot to talk about the congregation. And whole body, it begs the question whether whole body here means the single body, the person's own body, or does the teacher have the capacity by their teaching to direct the entire body of the congregation? Um, that's incredibly important because here you're talking about a teacher, and you're not talking about a teacher keeping the teacher's self perfect, right? This is the teacher keeping the whole body of the congregation well and healthy and whole and perfect. So, is there a perfect man out there, teleos aner, a perfect teacher? Um, this indicates that this is a warning to teachers. You got to be perfect. And he moves from this section on the whole body. I just want you to keep that in mind, to bits in the horse's mouth, right? So there's a little picture there, an illustration of where a bit goes. You see there's a bit, the arrow pointing to the horse's mouth. And what you get there is a metal rod, basically, in the mouth of a horse, and it goes all the way back behind their teeth. And it's not, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a horse, so I don't know how painful it is. But when you ride a horse, this is how you direct the whole thing. So the bit is connected to the bridle, and it's the leather straps that are connected to the bit that help control a whole horse. And this is the illustration that James uses here. And if we place bits, kalenus, now this is the same idea of bridle, kalenagogos is the same word. And if we place bits into the mouths of horses in order to make them obey us, we guide, metagamon, we guide their whole bodies, halon to saman. It's the same word in 3:2, okay? So just as the perfect teacher is able to take care of the whole body, here a bit is able to guide the whole body of the horse. So bit is the example for the tongue, or if not the tongue, because the word tongue's not used yet, it is the example of the teaching of the teacher. And so I think tongue is exactly that. Every time James uses tongue, he's talking about the capacity of a teacher to teach what's right or what's wrong. We'll see if that's true or not. It shows how the small piece moves a huge horse. And this is going to be the whole, entire chapter 3, 1 through 12, talks about how a tongue, being so small, has incredible power to move an entire person, an entire body, an entire congregation. And here the illustration is bit and horse. And then he uses we again. And if we place bits, so teachers, right? And this shows the power of the tongue or teaching, but also the power of the one who is the teacher. The teacher is the one who uses the bit. The use of body, specifically used for the horse's body here, but it's the same term used for the body of Christ elsewhere in the New Testament. So does it have a double meaning, i.e., a bad teacher could lead the whole congregation astray? I think that's exactly what it is, because, as we'll see, a bit doesn't guide a horse. The person who's riding the horse guides the horse through the bit. So the teacher guides the whole congregation by his or her tongue, by their teaching. And one who rides a horse guides a horse by the bit. It's the same. This is the illustration. This is how the illustration works. So yes, the tongue is the bit, but who is the one behind the tongue? It's the teacher, and that's the major point here with bits / teachers that guide The word guide is important too. Very next verse, James changes illustrations. Behold, even ships, while they are large and driven about by severe winds, they are guided, the same word here, metagegai, by the tiniest rudder. So again, you have something very small controlling something very big, and it's a pretty rhythmic term here. Wherever the will of the captain directs. Now that is what's very specific here. The use of a ship rudder is the same as the horse bit comparison. Something small directing something large. Use of the same language as guiding, as in 3:3, where the bit guides the horse, and here the rudder guides the ship. Uh, is the illustration saying the tongue guides the body, or is it saying that the teacher guides the tongue? I mean, that's the major question. And here in this illustration, James specifically mentions captain. In the horse bit illustration, James uses we guide, as in teachers. Who is the we? Is it the teachers? Of course it is. That's the point. And here he actually is specific, talking about in this illustration, captain. The captain guides the rudder. The captain's desire, the captain's will guides the rudder, and the rudder guides the ship. The teacher's will, the teacher's desire guides the teaching, and the teaching guides the congregation. So captains guide the small rudder, and that guides the large ship. So who guides the bit and that guides the horse? Well, teachers do. I mean, this is part and parcel of the entire section. So we get into this little section here, and here's a boat with a rudder. You see the guy standing there guiding the rudder, and the rudder's guiding the whole boat. So the relationship between the size of the rudder and the size of the boat is disproportional, right? The boat is very large. It can float with an entire, several people in it and all that. But the rudder is what guides it. But if the rudder doesn't have anybody guiding it, then what does the boat do? So you need a captain to guide the boat, to guide the rudder that guides the boat, just like you need a teacher that guides his teaching, that guides the congregation. So finally, is it the tongue? The tongue, or isn't it? So indeed, the tongue is a small member, melos, but it boasts bigly. Now that's, my little political commentary. Megala, bigly, great, makes great boasts. Oxai is a different word for boasts here. Katakalkakatai is what he's been using, which is a very Pauline term. But this is just a very shortened version of that. So it does have kind of refers you back to Paul by using this language. And Paul certainly makes a lot of boasts. So this is a subtle way of turning it back to one who boasts. And this is the first time James actually uses tongue, glossa, and he uses it in verse 5. So he's 5 verses in, almost halfway through this section before he uses the term tongue, but he begins the whole section with teacher, the didaskaloi. So members here is important. The word member, you have mikron, melos. Mikron is small. Micro is, we get the word micro from it. So a micro member, melos is member. This is the same terminology Paul uses when he's talking about the body of Christ and the individual members of it, the melos. So you get very similar language here as you do in Paul when he's talking about the body of Christ. The whole body has already been mentioned twice. Now you have small members. So the terminology is very similar to the kind of stuff that Paul uses in his letters. And I'm not saying that James has a copy of any of Paul's letters or vice versa. I'm just saying, James, it's clear in other parts of the New Testament that James has encountered Paul, that he's heard about Paul's teachings, and he's had to make judgments about it. And so I think he's responding to some of these kind of reports. Again, this is the first time the word tongue is mentioned in the whole letter. It certainly is the focus of the previous two illustrations. So the two illustrations before this show us how the tongue directs something much larger. But it's really the tongue is the teaching that directs the entire congregation. So whose tongue are we talking about? Is this a general warning about watching what you say, or is this a warning against false teachers or some of James' opponents? Teachers are the captains that guide the rudders that guide the ship. Teachers are the ones who need to watch their tongue since they are guiding the congregation. So I think it's not clear because there's certainly there's no consensus in scholarship, and scholars argue back and forth on that. In moral discourse in the Greco-Roman world, you certainly have some, James is borrowing from that terminology and that kind of critique. But I think this is a little bit more pointed, specifically with the vocabulary that James is employing. And if you look at the illustrations themselves, every time James talks about the illustration for the tongue, it's a bit or it's a rudder. But behind the bit and the rudder is the captain of the ship and the rider of the horse. And those are the teachers. The teachers have to take care of their tongue so that they teach the right things so that congregations don't get led astray. So, what do you think? I mean, is this clearly I'm teaching that this is James confronting teachers that are, in his estimate, teaching the wrong things or have the strong capacity to teach the wrong things. So they have to be careful in what they say, and they have to be consistent. And the consistency is really kind of the second part of James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. But he doesn't use tongue until halfway through, at the end of this section, this first section, chapter 3, verses 1 through 5a. He doesn't use the word tongue until the very end, but he uses the term for teacher at the very beginning. I mean, that's just one small reason I think this is a focus on teaching and teachers more than just a moral short essay on how you're supposed to talk. So if you have any questions whatsoever, just give me an email. Let me know if there's anything that you need to follow up on, any points of clarity, or any questions you have you want to further this conversation. The next lecture will focus on chapter 3, verses 5b through verses 12, where James kind of gets in more detail about issues revolving speech acts.